All right, we are back with page 3. This is take 2. Had an interruption from the mother, so had to talk to her for a second. Anyway, our scale, our period was 4 pi. So what I said is if you do have a scale that's bigger than 2 pi, instead of doing pi over 2 pi, 3 pi over 2, 2 pi, you can just make this 4 pi. And then I thought a nice scale to do would be pi, 2 pi, 3 pi, 4 pi. Honestly, the scale doesn't matter as much. You can kind of play around with that. And there are 2 different ways that you can graph it. I'm going to show you how to graph it by hand using a pattern. And then I'm also going to show you how to use your graphing calculator to help you. So we're going to start with 0. I put that in the middle because we are going to have some negative points. So think about if you plug in 0 into your original equation. So actually this is called g of x. So I'm going to call this part x, and then this is going to be our g of x side here. Okay, so if you were to plug in 0 for x, you would do 1/2 times 0, which is 0. Well, the sign of 0, we already talked about that, right? The sign of 0 is 0. So if you take 0 and multiply 1/2, you would still get 0. So that is going to be 1 point on your graph. If you wanted to use the pattern, remember the periodic functions repeat every period. So that means if the period is 4 pi, at 4 pi, you're going to have to be at 0 again. And if you go in this direction to negative 4 pi, you will also have to be at 0. We are going to prove that with our graphing calculator as well. Now for the sine function, halfway in between where you start and where you end, you also hit the middle mark. So if you start and you end at 0, halfway in between, you're also going to be at 0, which means at 2 pi, I should be at 0. And if I plugged in 2 pi to my graph here, 1/2 times 2 pi, I'm just going to write some of that work down. So if I plug that in, if I did 1/2 sine of 1/2 times 2 pi, okay, then 1/2 times 2 pi would be pi. So if I did 1/2 times the sine of pi, let's calculate. Well, the sine of pi we know is 0. So that means 1/2 times 0 is still going to be 0. Okay, so that is right. And then I probably am going to want to find out what happens at pi and what happens at 3 pi. Okay, so if I plug in pi into my original function, 1/2 times pi is pi over 2. The sign at pi over 2 is 1. So if I do 1 times 1/2, I'll get 1/2. Okay, so remember we said that is our new maximum. Well, halfway in between these two, you are going to hit your maximum. And I'm just going to label. So I'm going to go by halves. So if this is 1, this is 1/2. I'll just write scale by halves. Okay, so at pi, I am at 1/2, which means halfway in between these two, I should be at negative 1/2. And then I've created part of my curve. So at 3 pi, we would get negative 1/2. So again, all I'm doing is I'm substituting my x value in here, and then I'm just using the unit circle and what we've done before to find that out. Now, you can also use your graphing calculator, but when you do, whenever you graph a trig function, your mode has to be in radians. Okay, so you have to make sure you change your mode to radian. So that's what I'm going to do first. I'm going to go to mode. I'm going to select radian. And now I'm going to go to y equals. And this is 1/2. So I'm just going to put 0.5 sine 0.5 x. Okay, now you can just graph it. That graph isn't going to look very good. So let's go ahead and adjust our scale. Okay, you can do your window. So remember I said I was going to do 4 pi to negative 4 pi. So negative 4 pi to 4 pi. So you can put that right in there. It just converts it to a decimal. Your scale, you can see I'm going by pi over 2 or pi. I'm just going to put my scale in as pi. And then I'm going to switch this from -1 to 1 so I get a better picture. So I can see like the curve zoomed in there. And then if you want to see the actual points, you can either go to second calc, you could find the zeros, you could find a value. So if I press enter, I just have to plug in the x value. So let's say I want to know what happens at negative pi. I just type in negative pi, and then you can see it gives me the x value. Now it's just giving that in terms of a decimal. That's negative pi, and it says y is negative 1/2. So at negative pi, I am at negative 1/2. Which, if this is repeating itself, that's where I would expect it to be. The next one I would expect to be here. And then I would want to go up to 1/2 and then back to 0. If you want to look at all of the points at the same time, just go to your table set. You can start at 0, and then the change in the table, you're going to want to adjust that to be pi. Okay, so then you could go to second table, and now it's going to give you all of these. 0, pi, this would be 2 pi, 3 pi. Just be careful when you see this -5 e to the -14th, that rounds to 0, because that means you have 14 zeros in front of it. Okay, so now I can continue the rest of my curve here. And there you go. There is your sine curve. All right, for B, we are going to do cosine. Okay, so find the amplitude and period. So remember the amplitude is multiplied by the trig function. So your amplitude is 1/3. Okay, and then the period equals 2 pi over B. And in this case, your B value is 2. So if you have 2 pi over 2, then that is going to reduce to pi, and so that is going to be your period. Okay, so if your period is smaller than 2 pi, sorry, I would just keep your values how they were before, where you have pi over 2, and I do like every other one. So this would be pi over 2, and then pi, and then 3 pi over 2, and then 2 pi. And then you can see more than one cycle. So this is negative pi over 2, negative pi, negative 3 pi over 2, and then negative 2 pi. All right, and then what is happening to the graph here? So we have a vertical compression by 1/3, and then the horizontal compression by 1/2. Because remember, we are doing the reciprocal. All right, and then again, because the vertical compression is by 1/3 and that is affecting your amplitude, that means your new max / min is going to be 1/3 and -1/3. Okay, and you can definitely, again, you can use your graphing calculator for this. When you do your table, you can just pick 5 points. So 0, pi over 2, pi, 3 pi over 2, 2 pi. Those are standard ones that you can pick. This was x and h of x. And I am perfectly fine having you guys use your graphing calculator. I know this is probably a little overwhelming here. But you can also plug these in. So 2 times 0 is 0. The cosine of 0 is 1. 1 times 1/3 is 1/3. So this is now starting at the new maximum, which is 1/3. And don't worry if you are having a hard time with some of this. Just really do your best right now. Listening to the videos is going to be helpful. You will go over some of this next year, and your teachers will know that you'll need some extra exposure to that. So I plugged in the 1/3 cosine of 2x here, and now I am going to my window, and instead of 4 pi, I'm going to make this -2 pi to 2 pi. And then I'm going by pi over 2, so I'm going to change this to pi over 2. I'm going to keep it at 1. I can see my graph there. Again, with this, because it is the 1/3, you can just label this by thirds. So if this is 1/3, this is 2/3, this would be 1. So scale by 1/3. And this would be -1/3. All right, so then let's go to the table set. We'll start at 0. This time we'll go by pi over 2. So if you're going by pi over 2, at 0, you can see it's 0.33333 repeating. At the pi over 2, it's a -1/3. And then this goes to 1/3. And then -1/3. And then 1/3. So what you're missing there are the zeros. What's going to happen is if you're at 0, 1/3 here, I'm going to use a different color. And then at pi over 2, you're at -1/3. And then at pi, you're at 1/3 again. And then at 3 pi over 2, you're at -1/3. And then at 2 pi, you're at 1/3. What's going to happen is halfway in between those, that's when you're going to hit the 0 mark. So if you think, okay, what's halfway between 0 and pi over 2? If you do pi over 2 times 1/2, it would be pi over 4. So if you want to check what's happening at pi over 4, you could go to second table set, and instead you can do your pi over 4. And that's where you're going to see the 0. And then this rounds to 0. So halfway in between, you should hit the 0 there. And to get the curve, I usually will make each curve and then do like each cycle. This is going down, and that makes it a little bit easier. Okay, so I'm at my max, I'm halfway, I'm at my min. Halfway, I'm at my max. Halfway, I'm at my min. halfway at my max. So it does just keep repeating itself. And so if you can follow your pattern, that should make it pretty good. All right. And that is it for your day 1.